Let's talk a little bit about consent. So what is consent? If you had to come up with a definition or a sentence describing the meaning of consent, what would you say? Take just a minute and write down or talk to someone about what you think a good definition for the word consent is. Essentially, consent is giving permission or agreeing to something. So when might we need to have consent from someone? Or when might we need to give consent to someone? Specifically in the context of a relationship, what often comes to our mind first is consent when it comes to sex. But we also want to make sure to have consent present in all aspects of a relationship. That includes things like the places that we're going together, the people that we're hanging out with, the types of activities that we're doing, maybe the conversations we're having or the speed at which the relationship is progressing. We want to make sure that everyone is on board and okay with the things that are happening and that consent is present even in those decisions. We are going to be focusing in this video, though, on consent specifically when it comes to sex in a relationship. So to determine if consent is present, we have a couple of questions that we need to ask. The first question is, are the participants old enough to consent? So let's talk a little bit about statutory rape and age of consent laws in Idaho. In the state of Idaho, the age of consent is 16 by law, with what we call age considerations until 18. So what does that mean? Well, if someone is at least age 16 and below age 18, so they're 16 or 17, in Idaho, they can legally consent to have sex with someone who's also at least age 16 and within exactly 3 years of their age. This means that a 16-year-old could give consent to have sex with someone who's up to age 19 as long as they're not more than 3 years older than them to the birthday. So it's important to note that, if it was someone who, for example, just turned 16 and the other person was 19 3/4, that wouldn't fall within that 3-year age consideration. They would need to be not 3 or more years older than them to the birthday. Similarly, if somebody was 17, they could legally give consent to have sex with someone up to age 20, as long as they were within 3 years of their age, so they weren't 3 or more years older to the birthday. If someone is under age 16, they cannot legally give consent. So if it was, for example, a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old, the 15-year-old would be considered legally not old enough to give consent. If both people are under age 16, they're both considered unable to legally give consent. If both people are at least age 18, that 3-year age consideration gap goes away. So someone who's 18 can legally give consent to have sex with anyone within consenting age. So if we had a situation where there was a 15 and a 16-year-old engaging in sexual activity, the 16-year-old could get in trouble if charges were pressed. If both people were under age 16, depending on the situation, if charges were pressed, they could both get in trouble. Or if someone was 16 or 17 and somebody who was older than that 3-year age difference was engaging in sexual activity with them, then that older person could get in trouble if charges were pressed. So the legal consequences would depend on the specific situation, but they could include things like fines or jail time or even registering as a sex offender. But it's really going to depend a lot on the specific situation. So if you do have more questions about this age of consent law, feel free to reach out to Safe Passage or talk about it with maybe a teacher or a student resource officer at your school. If you have more questions or would like more clarification, we're happy to provide that for you. The second question we need to ask is, do both people have the capacity to consent? So what do we mean when we say capacity? Capacity is the ability to give permission or come to a mutual agreement on something. So what might take away someone's capacity or ability to give that consent? Take just a minute and talk to someone watching this video with you, or write down some things that you think might impact or take away someone's ability or capacity to give consent. Things like being under the influence of substances such as drugs or alcohol can impact someone's ability to give consent. Being unconscious or asleep or passed out will impact someone's ability or take away someone's ability to give consent. Someone has a severe enough intellectual disability that maybe impacts their decision making. That can impact their ability to give consent. If any kind of threats, especially if weapons are involved, that takes away their ability to fully give consent. If they're feeling pressured or manipulated or forced in any way to say yes, they haven't really given consent. In order to be able to have consent, both people involved need to feel completely safe and completely free to say either yes or no at any point. So, if one person is feeling at all pressured or forced or manipulated or threatened to say yes, then they haven't really given consent. So everyone needs to feel completely safe and free to say yes or no through every step. So just because someone maybe makes out with someone doesn't mean they're consenting to have sex. If someone gave consent before, it doesn't mean that they're giving consent each time afterward. If two people are married, that doesn't equal consent. Both participants have to feel completely safe to say either yes or no, or I changed my mind, or I don't want to do that, or anything like that. So we need to also know if both people agree to take part. So the best way to keep everyone as safe as possible is for them to communicate with each other and make sure that they're on the same page every step of the way. So really talk before, communicate, make sure that both people are on the same page. That's going to be the best way to make sure that both people are safe and to make sure that consent truly is present. So, we're going to go ahead and let you pause this video and watch the linked video we have about tea and consent. This is a fantastic video, so please pause this video, watch it, and then when you come back, we will finish up our discussion about consent and sexual assault. So, pause this video, go watch the tea consent video. Okay, so by this time you should have watched the tea consent video. Hopefully that clarifies everything. It's a really fantastic video and a really excellent analogy. So hopefully that clarifies any leftover confusion. If there is still confusion or you want some more clarification, again, please reach out to us. We're happy to talk to you more about that. So, we know that 2/3 of sexual assaults go unreported to law enforcement. Do you have any idea why that might be? Go ahead and take a minute, pause this video, and write down or think about or talk about reasons why you think so many sexual assaults are never reported to the police. So what did you come up with? Some reasons that we commonly see that somebody might not report a sexual assault are listed here. Sometimes people aren't believed or others assume that the report is false. Sometimes we have the impression that false reports happen more frequently than they actually do. Movies and TV and media might give us the impression that false sexual assault reports happen all the time, but we know that only 2% of sexual assault reports are false reports. And this is the same rate as any other crime. So 2% of burglaries are false reports, 2% of car theft reports are false reports, in the same way that about 2% of sexual assault reports are false reports. But an inaccurate understanding of that, or people assuming that it happens more often, might prevent someone from reporting. Talking about it multiple times is really difficult, especially if somebody has to testify in front of strangers or see the person that harmed them. Maybe they don't want the person to get in trouble, or they know or love that person even after they hurt them. We know that the majority of sexual assaults happen from somebody that the person knows. So often they have that relationship component there that might make it really tough for them to report or talk about what happened. They might be afraid of retaliation. They might be afraid that if they do report, the person who harmed them will harm them even more. They might have a history of sexual abuse. If someone's experienced sexual abuse in the past, they might normalize it and not realize that it's abusive. Or maybe they've experienced sexual abuse in the past and the outcome wasn't what they thought it would be. And so that disappointment might prevent them from reporting. Sometimes trauma can cause people to not remember details. So trauma can cause people to, maybe they forget exact details or the exact order of events, or they might remember details incorrectly. That's the brain's way of trying to protect itself, can sometimes result in that. Have you ever heard of the fight or flight response? So there's also a third one. We know that there's actually fight, flight, or freeze. So if someone experiences trauma, they might freeze up. We call that tonic immobility. It's sort of like a deer in the headlights situation. So if somebody experiences freezing or tonic immobility when a really scary or traumatic event is happening, they can't talk or move. So in a situation where that's happened, someone might ask them, well, why didn't you yell or why didn't you fight back? They might not be able to give a good answer to that, when really we know it's just the brain's way of protecting itself. In the same way that the brain's way of protecting itself is to maybe block out some of the really harmful or painful memories, or maybe sort of switch up that order of events or change some of the details. It's the brain's way of protecting itself, but maybe when they go back to retell or talk about what happened, it might kind of come out fuzzy or in strange orders, and it might make it sound like or stigmatize their story, or make it sound like maybe they're making things up, even though they're not, and their brain is really just doing its best to keep them as safe as possible. So that might keep them from reporting, or it might make them feel like something was their own fault or they did something wrong. Additionally, a rape kit can be very unpleasant. They might be afraid of testifying publicly. They might feel shame from their peers or their friends or their family. Or they might minimize what happened, saying things like, oh, I'm just fine, or it wasn't that big of a deal. So those are some common reasons why somebody might not want to report a sexual assault to the police. So we're going to go ahead and pause here one more time, and then we're going to come back with one more short video where we're going to talk about what can we do about all of these things. So again, one more reminder, I know these topics can be very heavy and very painful. So if these are sensitive topics for you, please make sure you're doing what you need to keep yourself safe and keep yourself well. So we're going to pause here, and then we will come back with one final video.